Welcome back to the Open Telco Infra Summit, part of our DSP Leaders coverage. And time now for our live Q&A show. I'm Guy Daniels, and this is the first of two Q&A shows. We have another one tomorrow. It's your chance to ask questions on open networking and infrastructure. Now, earlier today, we held a panel discussion that looked at the pros and cons of building your own open and disaggregated network cloud. We've already received a number of questions from you, but if you haven't yet sent in one, then please do so now using the Q&A form on the website. Okay, let's meet our guests who are eager to help with all of your questions. And joining us live on the program today are Beth Cohen, SDN Network Product Strategy at Verizon Business Group, Manish Singh, who is CTO, Telecom Systems Business for Dell Technologies, Paul Miller, Chief Technology Officer for Wind River, Terje Jensen, who is SVP of Network and Cloud Technology Strategy at Telenor, Vivek Sharda, who is SVP and Global Head of Telco Cloud at Rakuten Symphony, and Robert Curran, Consulting Analyst with Appledore Research. Hello everyone, it's good to see you all. Thanks very much for taking part in this session. Now, here's our first audience question, and it is as follows. Are telcos doing enough and investing enough in new open ecosystems, including open source? So what do we think of that? Manish, let's come across to you first for your thoughts on whether telcos are doing enough.
No, in my view, not enough. I think there are bright spots that are definitely out there in the industry, and there are a set of service providers who are leading the path towards the transformation, digital transformation, bringing in cloud-native technologies and more. But I'll definitely say that there are that it's not enough, and I'll say this: look, this transformation is not easy. It's not just about technology. It's about technology, process, and people. And that requires skill transformation, process transformation, and then ability to really take advantage of this whole new cloud-native technology and an open disaggregated ecosystem. When I talk about that, think about it. I mean, the operators need to really think about how are they going to consume technology coming from this open and disaggregated ecosystem. Which is very different from how they've went about building their networks in the past, sourcing equipment, monolithic equipment, legacy equipment from a handful of vendors, and stitching that together to create the networks. And here's what I'll say. If you really look at both, I would say, the telecom service providers and, for that matter, the telco vendors, and look at the stock price performance of either one of them over a decade, it hasn't been good. While a lot of the technology industry has continued to benefit from digital transformation. So I think the opportunity is huge. There is more work that needs to be done. The urgency is here and now. And last but not the least, what's going to define the future is AI and edge. And if service providers and telcos are serious about capitalizing on that opportunity, then I do think the transformation is necessary. And it's urgent, and there's a whole lot more that needs to be done.
Thanks very much, Manish. So big opportunity, not easy though, and more the industry can certainly do. Paul, let's come across to you. What's your views? Are telcos doing enough and investing enough?
Thanks, Guy. Well, as your viewers may be aware, our company, Wind River, has been involved in open source for many, many years, decades even, both from the Linux side as well as from founding open source initiatives like Starling X, which are used at high-scale telecom networks. And so we have a kind of unique perspective as a company that just produces software and works in open source as to what's going on here. If you look at the operator's role in this, they're very much a consumer of the technology, right? They consume the technology and they deploy it. Historically, there's been a reticence for the service providers themselves to enter the open source consortia and participate. We do think there's opportunity there. And I will tell you that from, kind of living in that open source domain for a while, that open source community is very much looking for the users of the technology to participate and affect what they're doing with the requirements for what they're looking for the technology to support. That's a bit different, and I think the hesitance previously has been that people who join open source are kind of expected to contribute code, and a service provider is obviously not going to do that. But they should be aware that their membership in the open source community is very, very important to drive that user experience, right? What does the actual consumer of the technology need into that open source community? The other side of it, I'd say, is very interesting, where if you look at the companies that are participating as the community grows in open source, you have the application providers, the legacy telecom equipment manufacturers that are producing core and edge technologies, whether they be RAN such as Open RAN or IMS core elements or otherwise. They, in order to optimize their applications, may have requirements on the virtual infrastructure for in the case of an Intel accelerator, a PNC state manipulation to reduce power consumption in the edge of the network. There's things that can be done by the application providers, and they should enter those communities if not already present to contribute those ideas so that the end result of the technology stack being open source based consumed by the service providers has the desirable attributes that can drive down TCO and maintainability costs. Also on the silicon side, we see companies like Intel heavily investing in bringing their technology into these open source communities, whether it be for accelerator technologies or processor technologies, and optimizing that solution for the lowest footprint possible and for the highest performance possible in the telco service provider network. So in summary, it's kind of really on one side, the operator consuming, and we really should see them step up, as Manish said, to contribute more, but really just from a user perspective, right? They don't have to contribute source code into that community. And then on the vendor side, having all the vendors come together, application, infrastructure, hardware, silicon, to fully integrate the technology and drive contributions into the open source community.
Yeah, good points. Thanks very much for that, Paul. We've got a few more comments coming up here, but first of all, Terry, let me come across to you as a CSP. The audience member here is asking the question: are CSPs doing enough? What would you say to that?
No, I think I broadly agree with what Paul is saying. I think it's important to remember that, for me at least, it's an ecosystem needs to be in place, and there are a number of roles to be played there as well. And of course, telcos needs to do their part of it. I think it's also important that maybe quite a few of the telcos, which I know at least, they are doing quite a lot within this space, but maybe not talking very loudly about it. Maybe as not as loud as a number of other parties or companies who are doing this. Then I fully also agree with Manish. I think the transformation clearly, which for me is a broader discussion of course than open ecosystems, but the transformation is also needs to be accelerated in some of the organization. But having said that, I think it's important also to reflect on the timing here and that we typically are doing this in order to meet a need. Either a business need or a customer need or authority needs and whatever. So the timing might not, be as optimistic as we believed before. For example, in some of the customer demands, like in private network and edge cloud, I think that was mentioned as an example, where we see that at least in some of the markets, it's moving a bit slower than what we believed maybe 2-3 years ago. Another thing, of course, is, I'm sorry for going back into a very traditional question or topic here, is that you should not forget that we are also delivering and operating a critical infrastructure. So and it seems that the authorities are strengthening, the requirements on what does that really mean for the society with the NIS2, for example, and those kind of things. So it's not like jumping from one thing to the other. I think we need to be aware of the roles what we are having there. Then, of course, there are, for example, in private networks, there are, or call it non-public services, there are opportunities. As I said, we are working with quite many partners in this space, and maybe not that outspoken or speaking very loudly about it as someone else are doing there. So I think it's a bit of a mixed picture in my mind on who is doing what, but I think it's also important that when we do something, of course, we have a clear purpose on why we're doing it, and then of course that comes back to the timing of it.
Sure, absolutely, yeah, Terry. Thank you much indeed for that. But as you say, there's a lot of factors to consider with these decisions. Okay, we have got more comments coming up. So Vivek, let's go to you first, and let me put that question to you as well. Are telcos doing enough here?
I don't think they are. And I think there's a nuance in that question as well, Guy. Telcos have been adopting and consuming open source for a while. I think Paul touched upon that. But consuming and adopting something is not the same as investing in it, even if you're buying products which have a lineage based on open source. For the open source community to thrive and actually become more relevant, more hardened to the point that Daria just made, etc., you have to have active participation and contribution into that ecosystem. And while the broader transformation theme around process, culture, workforce is critical, the tool itself cannot take you there. I think the telecoms community has had very few examples. We are in a slightly unfair and privileged position. We've got a parent company, Rakuten Mobile, who's actually built the assets that they use to build the world's first 5G cloud native and open network. And I think those examples are rare. Even if you go out into a non-5G space, you go back a few years, there are very few examples where the telcos have themselves not just invested, embraced in a technology, but done it in such a way that it can actually go out to the community. And I draw parallels to the banking and financial sector. I think there are certain banks, especially in the US, who have had phenomenal contribution done to certain open source projects, for example, in the space of autonomous cloud and cloud computing and governance. In scale, I don't think we've seen the equivalent happen from the telecom operators yet. And I think that is something that should change over time. It's not going to happen overnight. There are real constraints there. Another example I want to give on this is one of the largest UK MNOs has been very vocal and public in the last few years about the number of software graduates that they are hiring and bringing back into the workforce. And in a way, this is an acknowledgement that they need to get a little bit more involved in the business of the technology that they're building and consuming, not just look at the connectivity and the services that they're offering. I think there is growing recognition that you have to be an active contributor and an active participant, regardless of your choice of technology, but it becomes even more critical in the case of open source, in my opinion.
Yeah, good comments, Vivek. And as you rightly pointed out, that the question asked, well, there's two parts to the question, really. Are telcos doing enough, and are they investing enough in open ecosystems? A couple more comments to get through. So let's, first of all, Robert, let's hear from you next.
Yeah, I think it's been touched on a little bit already. There has to be a motivation for this. Is what's really going to be compelling about making this kind of a change? Because I think, as everybody's already mentioned, it's not just a technology change; it's a cultural change. It's a shift in how things operate. At the end of the day, this has to be predicated on a very strong desire to be more innovative and to be more agile. I mean, without those, there's less of a compelling reason to really embrace open. I think two other things that were mentioned here as well, I certainly want to reinforce, is that sense of community. Again, Paul mentioned that, reference Vivek mentioned that, Manish mentioned it. You stepping into a world of community is a little different than where most kind of telecom has been, for many different reasons, and that's really a different kind of behavior. The third thing I just wanted to mention was that I think around open source, it's interesting seeing the shift. I think there are still a lot of people who think that open source, I mean, that's one part of open, but they associate that with getting software for free, and that can't be the motivation. That isn't the right kind of attitude to bring into open source. Being involved in it is because you're going to contribute to it. You're going to get more out of it than you put in, but you do have to put in. You do have to make the investment, and it's not just about getting software for free.
No, absolutely not. Thank you very much, Robert, for those comments. And Beth, we'll come and hear from you to close out our round for this first question.
So, speaking as a person who works for telecom, I think we, as everybody else has said, a lot of things that are absolutely true, and but I want to say, I think the telecoms have a really hard time engaging with the open source community. I find we have an easier time engaging with the standards bodies. And so, because we've traditionally had that role of, setting the standards, working with our peers, making sure that, all the standards work together. And, because there's no question that telecoms really have a strong understanding that, we need to work together. We're peers. But I think we've always struggled with how to integrate open source in a way that makes sense. There's no question the telecoms have embraced OpenStack. Almost every telecom has a large OpenStack deployment out there. We're embracing ORAN, but how we contribute has been, and I think Paul and Manish both mentioned that, has been a real struggle for us. And I'll use the example of the Anakit project, which I've been involved in for the last 5 or 6 years, where, I was pushing internally to get more people in the, within Verizon to participate in the project. So I felt it was a very important project. It's a project to define infrastructure for software-defined and cloud-native workloads. Super important to the telecom industry. But every time I talk to the teams that supported these types of activities, they were like, well, I don't know if we want to do that. I don't know if there's benefit to us. I was like, there's absolute benefit to you. And they were just kind of relying on the vendors more to do the heavy lifting. And there's no question in my mind, we need to contribute, not necessarily code, although, by the way, we do write code, but absolutely need to contribute those requirements. That's what the industry really needs, because we're driving the requirements. And if we're not contributing, it is, as I've said many times to my coworkers, if we're not contributing the requirements, the vendors will, and we might not like the results.
Absolutely. Thanks, Beth. And it's fascinating that you brought up the standards contribution work, because if you go to a 3GPP meeting, for example, it's so different group of people in that than there are to, say, LFN meeting. Completely different, and a different kind of dynamic going on. Anyway, we could talk about this one a lot longer. Thanks very much. It was a great question we received in there, and fantastic answers as well from all of you. So moving on to our next viewer question. Getting into the financial arguments here a little. The question is, what is the ROI impact for a telco investing in open infrastructure? Is there any difference to legacy and proprietary approaches? Well, Terje, do you think you could maybe start us off with some thoughts about this?
Yeah, happy to do that, Guy. I don't think it's a one number, maybe to disappoint everyone. But I can probably share a couple of examples on what we have seen. So one case which we also have been talking about, I think, in earlier sessions, is a mobile core. What we moved then onto an open infrastructure, or called it a cloud platform, for example. And the case there, we actually saw savings in the range of roughly 40% of the supply cost, just to throw out a number there. And then, of course, this was a case where there were fairly high traffic growth, so we anyway need to invest in quite a capacity upgrade. So, but the case, of course, there is to move on to a cloud platform, as I said. That's back to what Vivek said, that I think there is important to embrace, for example, cloud as one of the elements on doing this. Then, of course, there are other domains, what we also been looking into, where the savings are, I would say, rather negative, where we are right now on that really opening up is not really competing with some of the hardcore throughput, for example, that nodes what we have in the network. So there are cases pointing in both directions in my mind where we are right now. But I think it's also important, and that's very important. It's not only to look upon the technical solution. I think Vivek and others also referred to that before. So it's not only the return of the system cost, but it's also to look into the opportunities which might come as a consequence of this, which could, for example, come as there are more tools available. There could be other ways to work, for example, which is also providing a benefit, for example, on the business, either to automate something or to allow for more innovation, lower the threshold for collaborating with partner, for example, or simply to use tools to avoid misconfiguration, for example. So I guess it's important to not only to look into the return on investment on the open infrastructure in isolation, but it's also the total way you are working. I think it's also very, very important what Manish said in the very beginning. So not look upon the open infrastructure as something unique. It's a part of a transformation and changing the way we are working, and that's the way we also should look into the return.
Great, thanks, Terry. Don't look at this in isolation. Excellent. Okay, more comments to get through. Paul, I'm going to come across to you next, though.
Thanks, Guy. Incredibly interesting question. And boy, there couldn't be a more stark difference between traditional and open methods for building telecoms infrastructure, and really positive ROI behind it. When we look at compare and contrast the traditional method, and I'll use the radio access network as an example, the service provider would have competition for their business at the front end of an RFP process, for the major telecom equipment providers that we know. But then once deployed, the telco service provider is kind of hamstrung to that particular infrastructure provider for sparing and services and software upgrades, all coming from a single vendor. As we move towards a more open and disaggregated business model, it puts the service provider in an incredibly powerful position in the business. If you look at the infrastructure layer with off-the-shelf server platforms such as from Dell, at the hardware layer, there's tremendous competition continuously, and the threat to being swapped out for another hardware provider that keeps that pricing low for the entire life of the network. Same thing happening at the infrastructure layer. My business participating there, providing virtualized Kubernetes infrastructure, there's a lot of competition for that business. We can't disappoint the service provider in any year. And then at the application layer, incredibly scary for the legacy vendors that are now participating at the telecom application layer. The push of a button of an orchestrator can rip out their application and be replaced by their competitor. So now that ROI is incredible. It drives competition and pricing down to the floor, and that competition is live and active for the entire life of the network. And then if you consider on the back end of this, as you've built out a virtualized network, you can now host additional revenue generating applications on a software-defined infrastructure that you could not, or you'd have to beg a equipment provider to provide to you as a service provider, now that you've got a fully cloud-based infrastructure. So a massive ROI, a return on that investment is possible if you move to an open disaggregated system.
Wow, Paul, thanks very much. Sounds like a very stressful place for a vendor at the moment. But as with all the challenges, there's opportunities. So if they grasp the opportunities. Beth, let's come across to you for your thoughts on the ROI question.
I think the ROI for me, and Paul said a lot of truth, and the vendors are very well aware of the balance of power. And I'll use an example. We launched virtual network services a few years ago, I think about 4 or 5 years ago now, based on a universal CP, based on open source. It was used OpenStack and had an orchestrator, and it had a lot of components that were open source. And the vendors were, I would say, pretty scared by what we did. Because there was a huge amount of pushback, and the vendors a number of them came out with rival products. A number of them came out with, ways that really strengthened their appliance model. So what I've been seeing is, particularly at the edge, a move away from that disaggregated open source model, which I personally think is very powerful, back toward an appliance closed, I wouldn't say fully proprietary, because there's a lot of open source components, but the vendors are really taking back that power and sort of driving those integrations that are needed to create those edge appliances. So there's definitely been a shift back and forth in power around how to use open source, and where it makes the most sense and where it doesn't. I think there's been more for the telco. We've maintained the balance of power in the hosted side of things, and now with the CSPs coming into the picture and really pushing their agendas into supporting telco infrastructure. I think that's going to be interesting how that plays out in the next year or two.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Beth. That pendulum is always in motion, isn't it? Manish, let's come across to you for your thoughts and input on this question.
Yeah, thank you, Guy. I really love what Paul said in terms of both the competition that, for example, for us here at Dell, we face at the infrastructure layer, but also the challenge around lock-in that we see, for example, in the RAN, but it's RAN core. I mean, take a look holistically at a mobile network. The number of suppliers in the supply chain, what, a handful on single hand you can count on your fingers. So when you think about ROI, competition is good, lock-in is bad. ROI has two parts to it. First, investment, and then how do we get the returns? Let's first look at the investment side of it. Historical approaches of using legacy monolithic architectures actually ends up in higher investment because the telecom networks are built and dimensioned for peak traffic and for resiliency with a lot of hardware that is thrown at the problem. And that in turn increases the amount of investment that has to go in. Cloud native architectures fundamentally bring the efficiency at the infrastructure layer where you can dimension the infrastructure and drive better utilization of that infrastructure based on the traffic needs that you have on the network. These principles are well understood in the enterprise world through the cloud transformation. And as telcos embark on this digital transformation journeys, that's the fundamental opportunity, first of all, to optimize on the investment side. Then comes the return on investment side of it, which, as I said earlier, as we start to look into the future, AI and edge are the two technologies that are going to define the future and create a lot of monetization opportunities. And again, moving away from those legacy, monolithic, appliance-based architectures to more cloud-native architectures, open, disaggregated. They pave the way for the operators to monetize and create more returns on their investments. It couldn't be simpler.
I like the way you say that, Manish. It couldn't be simpler. Absolutely. It's a simple message that needs to be understood. So if anyone finds anyone in our audience finds difficulties with this current situation, then let us know. Send in your thoughts. Please use that Q&A form and communicate with us, because we really do want to hear your own experiences as well. Right, let's get on to our next question then that has come in for this summit. And the question is about management. It's how is an open ecosystem monitored and managed in terms of faults, failures, and network KPIs, and which companies will provide the OSS and network management systems for disaggregated networks? Beth, are you able to address this question for us first?
I certainly can. Yeah, well, I live and breathe that every day. So, operations to a telco is critical, right? So we are that 7x24 highly available network that never goes down. And you have to, and the way you do it, it's not because there's any magic to it, is you have to identify single points of failure, you have to reduce them, and how do you do that? Observability, reporting, monitoring, and all those tools need to understand the concept of a disaggregated network. It needs to understand, it has to monitor the hardware separately from the software, and it has to monitor all the components of the software. We had to retool our operations systems to support this new architecture model. And that took several years, and now it's continually evolving. So what's been added to the mix in recently is a real emphasis on APIs, a real emphasis on standard APIs. We've been doing a lot of work with the TM Forum. We have contributed, I think last count, close to 30 APIs specifically around observability, understanding the network capabilities. and to allow our customers to use those APIs to connect to their own systems, connect to the applications, something that the telcos have traditionally not done a great job with. We're great at monitoring the network. We're great at monitoring, what's going on with the network. We're not great with tying what's going on with the network into what's going on with the applications performance. What do our customers care about? They care about the application performance. The network is just, a means to the end, if you will. And that, I think, is really an area where the open source community can really help, because we don't need proprietary APIs. We need standard APIs that can talk across systems and connect the systems and really drive that integration orchestration that is so needed to manage these enormous, complicated networks.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you very much, Beth. And fascinating what you're saying about application performance there as well. Okay, next, Paul, we'll come to you and then we'll go across to Vivek. But Paul, we'll come across to you first.
Thanks, Guy. I think I'm going to agree a lot with what Beth said. The experience we've had over the past several years, we're one of the few vendors that has a very highly scaled operational network running production traffic. And our experience from that is, yes, the open disaggregated technology that we're here talking about today needs to be solid, open source based, highly available for mission critical environments such as 5 and 6 nines availability in the telco environment. But once it's deployed, it's really about operating that system, right? Day 2 operations, the ability to upgrade and manage that infrastructure. Can you continuously manage, across configuration drifts that happen in the field between hardware bias systems? Are your Kubernetes security certificates expiring in different places, right? How do you debug a system? And is the system in the Northeast different from the Southwest, right? And how do your teams deal with that? And that really brings in a lot of tools with respect to analytics to give you visibility from a single pane of glass into that deployed system, as well as AI and automation that helps you operate that network. These networks have many tens of thousands of sites that are being operated as a distributed cloud infrastructure. And it's really beyond a single human being or a set of humans to operationally manage that. So you need software-based automation tools, such as Manish was talking about with AI and automations. And you really have to emphasize the skills of the people that are coming to help the service provider. As Beth also mentioned, retooling a service provider to understand cloud-native technologies, managing software-defined networks, dealing with Kubernetes and cloud-native infrastructure. That's a set of capabilities that really comes from a software background. And vendors that can come in and provide that expertise that also have experience from actually helping run these type of environments are priceless, right? They really help the operator move through this transformation. So there's a very heavy emphasis here on operations at scale, and the ability to automate these environments to make this entire initiative successful.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. Well, we'll come across to Robert soon, but Vivek, let's come across to you first for your comments.
Thanks, Guy. I think if I can just rephrase your question, I think the question was who's going to be responsible for providing the operations layer and the orchestration for the disaggregated networks as we go forward. And I think the key is in the word disaggregated. Compared to legacy full stack single vendor kind of monolithic deployments, you now have a telecom infrastructure that is composed of multiple different layers, typically from different vendors. And I think from a cloud native and an open standards based network, the single biggest critical factor, which is different than new, and I think Paul just touched upon it a little bit a minute ago, is the cloud native layer. It's the underlying cloud native platform. And that has a fundamental role to play in making the ability for you to have hundreds and thousands to millions of networks and nodes, which are now probably from multi-vendor environments, being operated under a single pane of glass infrastructure. So things like observability and metrics and reporting, right down from the BIOS and some of the silicon stuff, including P states and C states, which need to be reported for power management, down to Kubernetes level metrics, and then also catering to some of the actual containerized workloads that are running in those clusters, and the health of the clusters themselves, some of the traffic information, etc. I think the choice of your underlying cloud native platform becomes critical because at the northbound layer, OSS will still tend to standards, whether it's TMF, etc. So you're not necessarily going to have a complete throwaway from any existing investments you might have made as a mobile operator and say, you have to scrap everything on the OSS layer just because you're going disaggregated or cloud native. Quite the converse. It is still going to be standards based. It's just that the kind of metrics and reporting you're going to get and you should expect from your underlying cloud native platform needs to be that much richer, that much granular, so that your ability to then triage, analyze, and do business policy-based decision at the OSS layer is that much stronger. There's also an element of AI that's quickly coming in. For example, we are piloting doing predictive analytics for network failures, again, partly powered by our cloud-native platform. Now, the outcome of these predictive analytics is fed down to your existing OSS layer, and it's the OSS layer that will take a decision what to do in terms of a next best action in some of these cases. So I think the answer to the question is OSS continues to have a role, including the existing vendors. There's new vendors coming in. The orchestration layer is perhaps a significant need and a relatively new element in the disaggregated estate going forward. And all of this gets incredibly complicated if you don't have the right cloud native platform which enables and enriches these other elements to function in a way which allows you to move towards a near zero touch operation. That's my view on this, actually.
Great. Well, thanks for your view, Vivek. That's terrific. We're going to hear from Terrier in a moment, but Robert, I promised to come to you, so let me come across and get your views on this the whole monitoring and management of these open disaggregated systems.
Yeah, just quickly, I know the word has been mentioned several times already, but it is such a key word. Observability is the answer to the question, as it's stated. I mean, that is the mechanism by which you're going to monitor disaggregated and open networks comprised of many different vendors, and that's a new thing compared to conventional OSS. So, I mean, for people who've been in that industry and that job of managing the software systems, observability is the thing you really need to understand and know about. The good news is that it's been happening already for 10 plus years longer in companies who have massive cloud scale infrastructure. So it's not like telco has to start inventing this from scratch. There's a lot of knowledge, a lot of discipline, a lot of standards even already there, and best practice already there. I think the other thing I wanted to mention here is that, again, we're moving to a world where networks change much more frequently. It's not the big once a year, twice a year upgrade process. So that means that when we think about how networks are assured, we now start to have to think about back into the pipelines of software, the CI, CD, and CT, if you like, continuous integration, development, and test. That also comes into consideration. How do we make sure that software, as it's coming into the network and in every part of its life cycle, is going to do the right job? So it's not just a case that we start monitoring the network the day something goes live. Actually, we're looking into how software makes its way into the network and catching issues at an earlier stage of development. And that's also, I think, a bit of a new aspect here, rather than the very kind of block step change that we've had in a more sort of hardware-centric world.
Great. Thanks very much, Robert. And thanks for those views on observability as well. Terrier, let's come across to you, please.
Yeah, thanks. So actually, I think Robert actually mentioned one of my, at least my first point, that this is, in my mind, at least not a new requirement. And telcos and operators, we have always been responsible for delivering, the service levels that we have promised. But luckily, there are a few companies out there which are then supporting and helping us with solutions, and also with actually integration and also operations for a multi-domain, also multi-supplier setup. So I think that's I think the fact what we are seeing. Then I fully agree what Beth was raising, and also what Vivek was alluding to, that of course the openness in terms of cloudification, for example, and the open RAN and cloud native and those kind of things comes with the additional requirements for observing individual new models, new interfaces, new protocols, and so forth. That means that the tool set probably should then of course be updated or replaced in order to fully support that, because at the end, again, we are responsible as an operator or a telco to deliver the service there. But then of course it's the case what Robert was saying. I think in my mind we have been. This is of course a known problem for us, and there are ways to do it. Of course, it's simple, to add on new tools and new processes. So you have to renew, you have to replace, I think what Beth was also saying, you have to renew the setup. You have to start shutting down and disconnecting some of the things there. Otherwise, you're probably going to drown in complexity on the longer run.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Terje. And it's an area we're going to do a lot more coverage on next year. Okay, thanks very much. It's time now to check in on our audience poll for the Open Telco Infra Summit. The question we are asking this week is, what are the main barriers to realizing a broad and diverse open telco infrastructure ecosystem? And you can see the real-time votes appearing right here as we speak. And it looks like, well, it's pretty close between the ongoing dominance of the incumbent major vendors and also concerns over interoperability and integration. But we should also keep an eye there on the financial incentives as well. If you have yet to vote, then please do so, and we will take a final look at the voting during tomorrow's live Q&A show. Right, we still have time for some more questions, or at least one more question at least, and there's a good one here. Not all CSPs have integration as their core competency. There you go, it alludes to the poll results we've just seen. Isn't the best opportunity here really amongst the systems integrators and their ability to reduce costs? Vivek, let's start by asking you, what do you think to this question?
I think it's a great question, and I think it's actually a very relevant question as well. We're actually seeing this topic quite commonly in conversations we're having with the CSPs and mobile operators for two reasons. One is that a lot of the CSPs have typically, and I can't recall who it was, but when they've done single source models in legacy network procurement in the past, it's almost been like an outsourced managed service contract, single neck to choke, etc. And the move to a disaggregated network is by definition a move to say we're going to have to see a little bit more of moving parts, and that then immediately, if you want to stick to the comfort zone from a procurement and from a risk appetite point of view, the CSPs have two broad choices. They either have the network equipment vendor, let's say it's a core RFP or a RAN RFP, they have them lead the RFP, but they take care of the entire turnkey solution from an integration standpoint. And that's not necessarily a very viable model as we stand today, just because, and I think your poll showed that was the biggest concern, most of the legacy telecom equipment vendors aren't ready for fully disaggregated open networks, etc. Hopefully some of them will get there. Certainly promises have been made, but time will tell. So the second choice then the CSPs are left with is then to say, well, we'll have the systems integrator front end these large RFPs and these transformation programs. So there's definitely a massive opportunity. I think the opportunity also comes with a bit of dilemma for the systems integrator. A lot of them have existing relationships and business models and engagements with existing incumbent vendors, whereas there's a lot of newer, slightly more disruptive entrants coming into the market who are developing those relationships. They're not at the same scale as the incumbents. I mean, there's a clear, like a decade plus difference there in terms of lineage. But I think a lot of the SIs are recognizing that this is the way forward, because the CSPs are starting to surely but steadily starting to embrace disaggregation and open networks. So I think it's a massive, massive opportunity, not just from a procurement and a contractual model and an outcome-based point of view, also from a skill set point of view. With the best intent in the world, the majority of the CSPs today won't have necessarily the skill set and the process mindset to embark on a fully cloud-native, disaggregated, completely DevOps-led rollout on technologies that their workforce is not familiar with. Some of the CSPs are investing heavily in building those skill sets in-house, but the rest will react and respond to it as the network evolves and they see more inclusion and introduction of these technologies into the network. So till the time they get to that stage, the SIs have another reason why they can act as a catalyst, because they do have, on a comparative basis, a lot more of these skill sets that they can bring to bear to make these transformations happen.
Interesting, Vivek. Thank you very much for that. We had a separate question actually about skills and the lack of skills. That ties in very nicely with that. Paul, what are your thoughts here about the opportunities around integration?
Yeah, I think that I'm going to make a strong statement here. Maybe good for conversation here with the forum. I don't think SIs are going to be able to fix this. Now, SIs play their role, and they have a great deal of value to add in services. You mentioned kind of the smaller scale operator that may not have the staffing and expertise to absorb this kind of technology the way that a tier one might be able to. But even tier ones have difficulties absorbing this, distributed and rich new technology stack. So an SI is going to be able to provide network engineering services and deployment services and help manage and deploy the system, but they don't address the fundamental issue. And that really is when the service provider has a problem with a distributed Kubernetes infrastructure, who do they call? They've got to call the infrastructure provider. They have a problem with the application layer. The SI is not going to be able to answer the question. They've got to go to the application vendor. So the SI doesn't fundamentally solve this problem. I think what does solve this problem, I'll give a couple of examples. One is that in the partnership that we've done with Dell, we have this Dell Telecom infrastructure blocks where we're tightly integrating prior to delivery to the service provider, the hardware infrastructure, the silicon, the accelerator technologies, the BIOS configuration and management with the infrastructure layer into an integrated and revision controlled solution that then can be delivered to the service provider as a known good deliverable. This ensures that the service provider has a minimum expense for and complexity for integrating the solution in their network. And those lower two layers of the disaggregated network, the virtualization and infrastructure and the hardware layer, are where a lot of the issues happen. Also, on the infrastructure to application layer integration, where you have core elements or RAN edge components coming in as applications running on a virtualized infrastructure, that integration actually has to happen well before an SI or customer receives it. It's the concept of shifting left. And if you have the ability to create a partner integration strategy where prior to the GA release of your software, you're integrating the applications on that infrastructure layer. Now, again, as you're delivering that solution to the customer, they have less impact. They have less effort to expend on the integration problem. These are things an SI can't do because they're not active prior to the delivery of the software. They're not able to create an industry usable reference platform like the Dell Telecom infrastructure block. So we really think it's the ecosystem coming together, and it's really kudos to Vodafone and the white paper that Iago Tenorio published a little over a year ago, asking the industry ecosystem to come together and perform that integration to reduce the burden on the service providers. I really think that's critical. And the SI isn't going to be able to do that. Again, they still have their value in the overall service provider landscape, but to really get this thing adoptable, right, to get the open technology adoptable, we've got to participate as an ecosystem and integrate prior to handling to the customer.
Interesting. Thanks very much for those observations, Paul. I will let everyone know that this will be our final question, unfortunately, because we've been having such a great discussion. We've really rattled along at quite a rate today. Beth, I'm coming across to you next for comments on this integration issue.
I want to build on a lot of what Paul said, and my personal experience as well. It's a matter of control and who is in control. The operators have a very different business model than the SIs. Not to say the SIs don't have their place, and I would challenge Vivek on the skill sets. It's not that operators don't have those skill sets; they do, and they have actually, in some sense, better skill sets because they understand the networks. I do not find that the SIs have a really deep understanding of how networks work. And, networks at scale is what operators do. That's our bread and butter. That's what our customers buy from us. And the SIs can help us get there, but they cannot operate our systems in any sense of the way that we do ourselves in-house. And so, and at the end of the day, it's, our customers are relying on Verizon to deliver that network experience that, I used to say, our customers expect that when they make a phone call, it goes through 100% of the time. Same thing on the network side. Our customers expect the network to work 100% of the time. And we have that mindset that the SIs do not have that mindset, because the business models that they run under are different. And they focus on much less on process and more on developing software and developing systems, and yes, integration. But at the end of the day, the operators have to be the integrators that do the heavy lifting.
Great. Thank you, Beth. Always a contentious time when we talk about SIs on one of our summits, which is great. I'm going to give our other guests a chance to respond to this question as well before we wrap up for today. So, Manish, let's come across to you next, please.
Oh, thank you, Guy. I think this is really a good question, because when you start to think about disaggregating the entire stack, it's going to take an ecosystem approach to go solve for some of these integration problems. And because these integration problems are going to come in different phases of the product lifecycle. There is, at the front end, there is the product integration challenge of how do you take different pieces of the technology, the infrastructure, the cache layer, the workload, do all the integration of that. There is that part. Then there is the deployment phase where or rather I should say install and commissioning phase, where you actually are going to install and commission the network, but again, sourcing disaggregated technology. Then there is the operational and the optimization phase, where again, you need different capabilities. So first and foremost, we talked about it, process and skill transformation, in my view, is fundamental as we start to think about cloud native technologies and cloud native transformation. Number two, Paul touched on it. I mean, part of this burden has to be taken up by the ecosystem. From a Dell standpoint, I mean, we work with Wind River. We have introduced the Dell Telecom Infrastructure blocks, which is, again, taking up and doing that integration work and all that engineering work upfront to reduce the integration burden for the service providers. We also then think about, setting up things like OTEL, our Open Telecom Ecosystem Lab, a lab infrastructure. We bring in the workload partners, put in the integration pipeline, and do integration on a continuous basis. I'll give you an example of one of the greenfield dish networks, one of the service providers who has actually deployed an open disaggregated network. And I was at Fuse with Sid from Dish, and he talked about, in their approach, outsourced testing, as far as integration is concerned, Dish has been taking up the integration work. So I think there is this problem has to be looked on from the service provider's lens of what are the things that they want to insource and build muscle to do themselves. And there are obviously areas that they are going to go reach out into the ecosystem and partner. And last thing I'll say, I'll also again just pick on what Paul said around the really good blog that Vodafone published, detailing really through the life cycle of the network, right? I mean, from product integration all the way to install, commission, to deployment, different phases, and the integration challenges that the industry needs to solve for. So, yeah, I mean, just to summarize, I think SIs have a role to play, but this is not just an SI only role here. Different players in the ecosystem, including the operators, have a role to play to solve for this.
Yeah, thank you, Manish. It's absolutely becoming apparent that. Yeah, thanks very much for those comments. Robert, your views on the integration challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I'm conscious where we are in the discussion today. Very, very interesting discussion. Look, all the comments in response to this question, I think, have point to something quite fundamental about open and disaggregated networks, which is choice. Not every CSP has the sort of resources to be able to do their own system integration. Plenty don't and will never have it and don't want to have. But the point is that I think the open disaggregated movement is providing people with the ability to say, look, where do you want to play, both as a CSP and as a provider, as a supplier. The interesting comments from Paul about Dell and Wind River collaborating, kind of moving up the food chain to say, look, we're actually not just going to be component providers. We're going to provide something that is pre-assembled, pre-tested, pre-validated, and that's a different role for suppliers to take. And I think that's part of what we're seeing from a kind of analyst point of view is the rearrangement of the market landscape. It's not the case that open and disaggregated means, hey, it's a field day for SIs. SIs have got to invest in the telco skills. Beth identified, they don't always have the telco knowledge. They've got to step up too. And looking at how some of them are, many of them aren't, but some of them are, is kind of interesting. So I think the range of answers that we've had even to this question on this conference kind of points to, I think, a success, progress for open and disaggregated. It allows us to ask these questions, and it allows CSPs and vendors to have more choice about where they play, how they play, what the behavior is. It does require change. If you want the benefits of all of this, if you want the agility, the speed, the innovation, then you're going to have to change, and that should apply all the way down the supply chain. And if your vendors aren't changing their behavior, you're probably doing something wrong, or they're probably doing something wrong. So I think that's kind of that's my kind of summary from this one question, but some of the feedback we've had. It's a positive thing.
Absolutely, Robert. Thank you very much. And as you say, it's choice as well. Terry, final thoughts from you for this program. So, what do you think the main issues are around the integration challenge?
No, thanks, Guy. I will try to be quick. I think we are probably at the end of the session. So in my mind, I'm coming from that it is the telco who is responsible, that it works, and the services we are providing using the systems we have. One of the roles we have identified in order for this to work is integration. But I think it's important to look upon this as a role which can be filled with either from the dedicated integrator. It could be one of the lead suppliers. It could be another operator. I think we know that there are a few operators out there which is also selling integration services, and then of course ourselves. And what we have seen is that there needs to be an assessment of the capabilities, and this needs to be in many cases a local assessment in the relevant markets, looking into the capabilities, the quality, the time, and also the cost, of course, which the question is also addressing, that the cost aspect of is quite important there. Then, of course, it's also important to discuss cost of what. Is it cost of the total solution, and then break that down into what is the work, what is the components, and so forth. Then it's also important, I think, and I think Vivek also pointed to that a few minutes ago, that it's in my mind a shift from that doing an integration once and then you stay with that for 5 to 10 years until you replace the whole system, into a much more dynamic, much more, call it DevOps, or whatever you want to call it, way of working it. So it's not only a once in the integration work, it's also a continuous upgrade. And that comes then, of course, with additional requirements into this integration role. And it also needs to be brought into the discussion about not only who to engage in this kind of tasks, but also, of course, the cost. So it's not only the one-time integration cost to compare, but it's also the quality and the continuous integration work which needs to be done with upgrades and any changes there. So it's not, in my mind, a simple, straightforward answer to that. And it's one of the key questions, of course, to the whole openness, I think, what Robert was alluding to. So I'm just supporting a lot of the things said so far, but I think it's not a simple answer to that in my mind. And it's very key, I think, what Robert says to that it contains also and allows us to have a flexibility, what we need in the different markets, and also what we need in the different domains. So it's not, again, one simple, straightforward answer. I don't think it's up to one to reduce the cost as well. Again, it's also the telco which is responsible for the total cost at the end. So that's how simple I see it.
Yeah, thanks very much, Terry. And you can always count on our viewers to ask the most difficult questions. Right, we are out of time. Thank you so much to all of our guests who joined us for this live programme. Do remember to send in your questions for tomorrow's live Q&A show as soon as you can. Don't leave it too late. And please take part in the poll. There is still time for you to have your say. Now, here's the agenda for tomorrow, for day 2 of the summit. We have a panel discussion for you on the evolution of the Open Mobile Core Network, and we've got interviews with Telefonica and MTN Group. Until then, thanks for watching and goodbye.